The exchange that unfolded between Congressman Seth Moulton and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth during a congressional hearing was unsettling not because of raised voices or partisan tension, but because it illuminated a far more serious and enduring issue: the erosion of accountability at the highest levels of civilian leadership within the United States Department of Defense. What the public witnessed was not merely a clash of personalities or procedural disagreement. It was a revealing moment that exposed a fundamental contradiction between how accountability is enforced within the military and how it appears to be avoided by those who sit above it. At its core, the hearing raised a question that every service member understands instinctively. When sensitive or classified information is mishandled, consequences follow. That principle is deeply ingrained in military culture. It is taught from the first day of basic training and reinforced throughout a service member's career. Accountability is not optional. It is not situational. It does not depend on political alignment or public relations success. It is absolute because lives depend on it. Yet during this hearing, accountability was treated as something abstract, ambiguous, and ultimately transferable, something that could be redirected upward to president or deflected sideways through vague language. That contradiction was not lost on those watching, especially members of the armed forces who have lived under far stricter standards for far less consequential actions. Congressman Seth Moulton, himself a former Marine Corps officer with combat experience, did not approach the questioning as political theater. His tone was firm, direct, and grounded in institutional knowledge. He understood the mechanics of military operations, the rules governing classified information, and the gravity of mishandling sensitive details during ongoing combat missions. His questions were not complex. They were not traps. They were, in fact, remarkably simple. Did the launch time of F-18 aircraft operating in hostile airspace originate from U.S. Central Command? Was that information classified when it was transmitted? And if an inspector general determines that classified information was shared improperly on an unclassified system, would the Secretary of Defense accept accountability? These questions strike at the heart of military discipline. Launch times are not trivial details. They define operational windows, exposure to enemy defenses, and risk to pilots. Even in the absence of targets, coordinates, or unit identifiers, timing alone can compromise mission security. This is not a controversial assertion. It is a basic operational reality acknowledged across every branch of the U.S. military. Instead of offering clear answers, Secretary Hegseth repeatedly avoided the substance of the questions. He introduced a novel and deeply troubling argument that any information he communicates is inherently classified by virtue of his position. This claim represents a profound misunderstanding or misrepresentation of how classification works within the Department of Defense. Classification is not determined by rank or job title. It is determined by content, risk, and formal marking. The entire purpose of classification systems is to create clarity across the chain of command. Information is labeled so that everyone handling it understands how it must be protected. Suggesting that everything said by the Secretary of Defense is automatically classified collapses the system entirely. If everything is classified, then nothing is meaningfully classified. The system ceases to function. More importantly, that argument does not absolve responsibility. If information is classified, it must be handled on classified systems. If it is unclassified, it must be acknowledged as such. What cannot be justified is transferring potentially classified operational information onto unclassified communication platforms, and then refusing to confirm its status when questioned by Congress. The discomfort in the hearing room grew not because the Secretary was accused, but because he declined to engage with accountability, even hypothetically. When asked whether he would accept responsibility if the Department of Defense Inspector General concluded that the information was classified, the answer was not reassurance. It was evasion. Accountability was framed not as a personal obligation, but as something that flows exclusively through presidential authority. This distinction matters deeply. Civilian control of the military is a foundational principle of American democracy. It ensures that the armed forces remain subordinate to elected leadership. But civilian control does not imply civilian exemption from standards. Leadership without accountability is not control. It is immunity. And immunity at the top corrodes trust throughout the institution. What made this moment particularly striking was the context in which it occurred. Since assuming office, Secretary Hegseth has overseen the removal of multiple senior military leaders, including generals and admirals. These dismissals were publicly justified in the name of accountability, discipline, and restoring trust in leadership. Yet when asked to explain why these officers were fired, the secretary repeatedly declined to provide specific reasons, stating only that they serve at the pleasure of the president. That phrase, while technically accurate, is not an explanation. It is a procedural statement, not a justification. In military culture, removal from command, especially at the general or admiral level, is a career-ending action. It carries reputational consequences that extend far beyond the individual officer. To invoke accountability without explanation while resisting accountability for oneself creates a stark double standard. This disparity did not go unnoticed. When Congressman Moulton pressed the secretary on whether accountability applies to him as well, the question lingered unanswered. The implication was unmistakable. Accountability is something enforced downward, not upward. It applies to those without political power, not to those who wield it. For service members watching this exchange, the message was deeply unsettling. They know from experience that intent does not excuse procedural violations. Success does not negate improper handling of information. Countless military careers have been ended not because missions failed, but because rules were broken even inadvertently. That standard has long been justified as necessary for discipline, security, and trust. To understand why the exchange between Congressman Seth Moulton and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth struck such a nerve, one must first understand how the U.S. military classification system actually works. This is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. Classification is governed by strict laws, executive orders, Department of Defense regulations, and decades of institutional practice. It exists not to protect reputations or political narratives, but to safeguard lives, missions, and national security interests. At its most basic level, information is classified based on content and potential harm, not on who communicates it. The idea that a senior official's words are automatically classified simply because of their position is not just incorrect, it is dangerous. Such a belief undermines a very framework that allows thousands of service members, analysts, commanders, and civilian employees to operate securely and effectively every day. In the Department of Defense, information is classified when its unauthorized disclosure could reasonably be expected to cause damage to national security. That damage may range from confidential harm to secret or top-secret consequences, depending on severity. Crucially, classified information must be explicitly marked with its classification level. This marking is not a formality. It is a functional requirement designed to ensure that everyone who handles the information knows exactly how it must be protected, stored, transmitted, and discussed. This is why Congressman Moulton's line of questioning was so precise. He was not asking about operational success or political intent. He was asking about process. Did the launch time information originate from U.S. Central Command? Was it transmitted to the Secretary of Defense on a classified system? And what was its classification marking at the time it was received? These questions matter because classified systems exist for a reason. Secure networks are designed to prevent interception, compromise, or unauthorized dissemination. Unclassified systems, by definition, do not offer the same protections. The moment classified information is transferred from a secure system to an unclassified one, the rules have been violated, regardless of outcome, intent, or mission success. Launch times, in particular, occupy a sensitive place in operational security. Even absent targets, routes, or unit designations, timing information alone can reveal patterns, capabilities, and vulnerabilities. In hostile environments, adversaries study timing relentlessly. They analyze launch windows, response intervals, and operational rhythms to anticipate future actions. This is not theoretical. It is standard practice among state and non-state actors alike. For pilots flying combat missions, especially into contested airspace with active air defenses, launch timing can be the difference between mission success and catastrophic loss. That is why such information is tightly controlled. It is why air tasking orders, flight schedules, and operational timelines are treated with extreme care. And it is why service members are trained repeatedly that even partial disclosure can have lethal consequences. During the hearing, Secretary Hegseth attempted to deflect this reality by emphasizing that no targets, names, locations, routes, or methods were shared. While this may be true, it misses the point entirely. Classification is not determined by whether everything was disclosed. It is determined by whether anything disclosed could reasonably endanger operations or personnel if compromised. More troubling was the Secretary's suggestion that because the mission was successful, the discussion of classification was moot. This argument directly contradicts military doctrine and legal precedent. Success does not retroactively declassify information. A mission's outcome has no bearing on whether procedures were followed correctly. In fact, some of the most serious classification violations in military history occurred during successful operations. The military does not measure compliance by results. It measures compliance by adherence to rules. That distinction is intentional. If success were allowed to excuse procedural violations, discipline would collapse. Individuals would begin to take unauthorized risks, believing that favorable outcomes would shield them from consequences. The system is designed precisely to prevent that mindset. Another deeply concerning element of the exchange was the assertion that discussing classification status in a public forum is itself impermissible. This is simply not accurate. While the content of classified information cannot be disclosed publicly, the fact that information is classified or unclassified can often be acknowledged without harm. Indeed, Department of Defense regulations require classification markings precisely so that status is unambiguous and communicable. Congressional oversight depends on this clarity. Lawmakers cannot perform their constitutional role if executive officials refuse to even confirm whether information was classified at the time of transmission. Oversight becomes impossible when basic procedural facts are withheld under the guise of security, especially when those facts are central to determining whether rules were followed. This is why the Inspector General process exists. The Department of Defense Inspector General is tasked not with political adjudication, but with institutional protection. Its role is to determine whether laws, regulations, and policies were complied with, and if not, why. The IG does not exist to punish success or reward failure. It exists to uphold standards uniformly. When Congressman Moulton asked whether the Secretary would accept accountability if the Inspector General found that classified information had been shared improperly, the refusal to answer was revealing. Confidence in compliance would invite a straightforward response. Evasion suggests apprehension, not about the investigation itself, but about its potential conclusions. For service members observing this exchange, the implications were stark. They know that if they move classified information, even inadvertently, onto an unclassified platform, explanations about intent or outcome would not protect them. Investigations would follow. Careers would be jeopardized. Accountability would be immediate and personal. This is a standard under which intelligence analysts, junior officers, enlisted personnel, and civilian employees operate every day. It is justified as necessary for national security. When senior leaders appear to operate under a different standard, the credibility of the entire system is undermined. Segment 2 underscores why this controversy cannot be dismissed as a misunderstanding or partisan dispute. It is about whether foundational rules governing classified information remain intact at the highest levels of leadership. If those rules are reinterpreted to accommodate power rather than constrain it, the consequences extend far beyond a single hearing. In the next segment, we will examine how deflection, ambiguity, and rhetorical maneuvering during the hearing weaken leadership credibility, and why direct answers are not a courtesy in military oversight, but a requirement. If Segment 2 established why the classification issue itself was serious, Segment 3 examines something equally consequential: how leadership credibility erodes when direct questions are met not with answers, but with deflection. In military institutions, communication is not merely a matter of style or preference. It is a core component of command authority. Clarity is not optional. Ambiguity is not neutral. When leaders refuse to answer straightforward questions, especially under oath or during formal oversight, the silence itself becomes a message. The hearing revealed a consistent pattern. Congressman Seth Moulton asked narrowly framed, yes or no questions grounded in Department of Defense procedures. These were not hypothetical traps or politically loaded accusations. They were designed to establish basic facts: origin, classification status, transmission method, and accountability. Yet time and again, those questions went unanswered. Instead, Secretary Hegseth relied on rhetorical maneuvers familiar to anyone who has studied institutional crisis management. He reframed questions to emphasize mission success. He broadened the scope to include unrelated operational outcomes. He substituted general statements about leadership or authority for specific procedural explanations. And when pressed, he invoked presidential authority as a shield against personal responsibility. This pattern matters because leadership communication in the military is governed by a different standard than political messaging. In uniformed service, evasion is not interpreted charitably. A commander who refuses to answer subordinates' clear question about safety, rules of engagement, or operational risk is not seen as strategic. They are seen as untrustworthy. Trust, once damaged, is extraordinarily difficult to restore. The refusal to answer whether accountability applies personally to the secretary was perhaps the most telling moment of the exchange. Accountability is not an abstract concept in the military. It is operationalized daily. Commanders are held responsible not only for their own actions, but for those of their units. The principle of command responsibility is foundational. Leaders are expected to accept blame when things go wrong, even if they were not personally at fault, because leadership entails ownership. Against that backdrop, the suggestion that accountability applies only upward to the president represents a fundamental inversion of military ethics. While it is true that civilian leaders serve at the pleasure of the president, that does not negate their obligation to exercise judgment, comply with regulations, or accept consequences when standards are violated. Serving at the pleasure of the president is a constitutional mechanism, not a moral exemption. What made this evasion particularly damaging was its contrast with how accountability has been enforced elsewhere. As discussed earlier, multiple senior military leaders were removed from their positions under the banner of restoring discipline and accountability. Those removals were not accompanied by detailed public explanations, yet they were justified as necessary for institutional integrity. When accountability is invoked to justify firings but resisted when applied inward, it ceases to be a principle and becomes a tool. The hearing also exposed a troubling conflation between authority and infallibility. Secretary Hegseth repeatedly implied that because the mission was successful and because he occupies a senior role, scrutiny of his decisions was misplaced. This mindset runs counter to everything the military teaches about leadership. Success does not immunize leaders from review. In fact, successful operations are often examined most rigorously, precisely because they shape future doctrine and behavior. Military after action reviews exist for this reason. They are brutally honest by design. Participants are expected to identify mistakes even when outcomes are positive. The goal is institutional learning, not personal vindication. When leaders resist scrutiny by pointing to success, they undermine that culture of continuous improvement. Another dimension of the exchange that warrants attention is the effect of tone. Throughout the questioning, the secretary appeared dismissive of the premise that Congress was entitled to clear answers. This posture risks normalizing contempt for oversight. In democratic systems, civilian oversight of the military is not adversarial by default. It is a safeguard. When executive officials treat oversight as an inconvenience rather than a responsibility, the balance of power begins to tilt. For service members watching this exchange, the implications were profound. Many have experienced investigations where minor procedural errors resulted in severe consequences. They know that explanations such as "nothing bad happened" or "the mission was successful" carry little weight. The rules are enforced precisely to prevent future harm, not merely to punish past failures. When senior leaders appear to operate under a different communicative standard, one where evasion is tolerated and clarity is optional, it sends a corrosive message. It suggests that honesty is situational, that transparency is negotiable, and that power determines the boundaries of accountability. Over time, such perceptions weaken discipline not through rebellion, but through disengagement. People stop believing in the system even as they continue to operate within it. Segment 3 reveals that the issue was not merely what Secretary Hegseth said, but what he declined to say. In institutions built on hierarchy and trust, Silence in response to clear questions is rarely neutral. It signals either uncertainty or unwillingness to accept responsibility. Neither is reassuring when national security is at stake. In the next segment, we will examine the sharp contrast between how accountability has been applied to uniformed leaders and how it appears to be resisted by civilian leadership, and why that double standard threatens both morale and the legitimacy of civilian control itself. One of the most revealing aspects of the congressional exchange was not the debate over classified information itself, but the stark contrast it exposed between how accountability is imposed on uniformed military leaders and how it appears to be resisted by civilian leadership at the very top of the Department of Defense. This contrast is not merely procedural. It goes to the heart of civil-military relations, institutional fairness, and the moral authority required to lead a professional fighting force. Since assuming office, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has overseen the dismissal of multiple senior military leaders, including generals and admirals. These removals were publicly framed as necessary act of accountability, steps taken to restore discipline, trust, and effectiveness within the armed forces. The language used was firm and uncompromising. Accountability, the public was told, was back. Standards would be enforced. Leadership failures would no longer be tolerated. Yet when Congressman Seth Moulton asked the most basic follow-up question, why these officers were fired, the answers were strikingly absent. The secretary repeatedly fell back on a single phrase: they serve at the pleasure of the president. While constitutionally accurate, this response functioned as an evasion rather than an explanation. It clarified authority, but not reasoning. It justified power, but not judgment. In military culture, the distinction between authority and accountability is crucial. Authority allows leaders to give orders. Accountability requires them to explain their decisions. When a general or admiral is relieved of command, the consequences are severe and permanent. Careers spanning decades end instantly. Reputations built over a lifetime of service are irrevocably altered. Even when official explanations are limited, the act itself sends a powerful signal throughout the force. That is precisely why such decisions are traditionally accompanied by at least a general rationale: loss of confidence, failure to meet standards, or breakdowns in trust. These explanations serve not only the public, but the institution itself. They reinforce the idea that standards are objective, consistent, and tied to professional conduct rather than political favor. The refusal to provide even minimal explanations for the dismissal of senior officers raises troubling questions. If accountability is invoked but never defined, it becomes arbitrary. If discipline is enforced without transparency, it begins to resemble punishment rather than governance. And if leaders demand accountability from others while declining to articulate their own standards, legitimacy erodes. This dynamic became especially stark when the same secretary, who declined to explain the firings, also resisted accountability for his own actions. When pressed on whether accountability applies to him if an inspector general finds wrongdoing, the response was not affirmation but deflection. Responsibility was shifted upward to the president or outward to mission success rather than inward to personal conduct. For service members, this double standard is impossible to ignore. They understand hierarchy. They accept civilian control. But they also believe, because they are taught to believe, that accountability is universal. From the youngest enlisted member to the highest-ranking officer, the rules are supposed to apply equally. That belief is essential to discipline. Without it, obedience becomes transactional rather than principled. The phrase, "they serve at the pleasure of the president," has a long and legitimate history in American governance. It ensures civilian supremacy over the military and allows elected leaders to shape defense policy. But it was never intended to function as a blanket justification devoid of explanation. Civilian control does not require civilian opacity. On the contrary, it depends on civilian leaders demonstrating judgment worthy of their authority. When generals are fired without explanation, while civilian leaders refuse to answer basic questions about their own conduct, the message sent to the force is corrosive. It suggests that accountability is not a shared value, but a one-directional mechanism. It flows downward, not upward. It disciplines the powerless, not the powerful. This perception carries real consequences. Military effectiveness depends not only on equipment and strategy, but on trust. Trust that leaders act in good faith. Trust that rules exist for reasons, not convenience. Trust that sacrifice is honored, not exploited. When that trust weakens, morale declines, not dramatically but quietly. Cynicism replaces commitment. Compliance replaces conviction. The dismissal of senior officers also has implications beyond individual careers. Generals and admirals are not interchangeable managers. They are repositories of institutional memory, strategic experience, and operational judgment. Removing them without clear justification risks signaling instability rather than reform. It raises concerns about politicization, especially when dismissals appear disconnected from professional performance and tied instead to vague notions of representation or alignment. Representation is a legitimate concern in any large institution, including the military. Diversity of background, experience, and perspective strengthens decision-making. But representation cannot substitute for accountability, nor can it serve as a vague justification for removing leaders without articulating specific failures. When representation is invoked without explanation, it risks being perceived as pretext rather than principle. Congressman Moulton's frustration during the hearing reflected more than personal impatience. It reflected an institutional alarm. He was not merely asking why individuals were fired. He was asking whether standards exist, whether they are applied consistently, and whether anyone at the top is subject to them. The inability or unwillingness to answer those questions undermines the moral authority of civilian leadership. Authority may derive from constitutional structures, but legitimacy derives from conduct. Leaders who cannot explain their decisions cannot expect unquestioned trust. Leaders who demand accountability without accepting it invite skepticism rather than loyalty. This imbalance also threatens the principle of civilian control itself. Civilian control is strongest when civilian leaders are seen as fair, transparent, and accountable. When civilians appear insulated from consequences while enforcing discipline on the military, resentment grows. That resentment does not manifest as insubordination, but as disengagement. The relationship becomes transactional rather than ethical. Segment 4 exposes a central contradiction. Accountability has been declared a priority, yet its application appears selective. Generals are removed without explanation. Civilian leaders resist scrutiny. The language of discipline is deployed, but the practice of responsibility is uneven. In the next segment, we will examine the role of the Department of Defense Inspector General, why institutional oversight exists, and what it means when leaders appear resistant to the very processes designed to protect the integrity of the military itself. At the center of the controversy surrounding the congressional hearing lies an institution specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of crisis of confidence: the Department of Defense Inspector General. The existence of the Inspector General is not incidental to military governance. It is foundational. Oversight mechanisms are built into the defense establishment not to undermine authority, but to preserve legitimacy, discipline, and public trust. The Inspector General system exists because the military, by necessity, operates with extraordinary power and secrecy. That power must be balanced by rigorous internal accountability. The IG's mandate is clear: to investigate allegations of misconduct, violations of law or regulation, abuse of authority, and failures of procedure, regardless of rank or position. In theory and in law, no one is exempt. This is why Congressman Seth Moulton's repeated references to the pending Inspector General review were so significant. He was not issuing a verdict. He was invoking process. He was reminding the Secretary of Defense and the public that accountability in the Department of Defense is not determined by press conferences or political rhetoric, but by established investigative mechanisms designed to protect the institution itself. When senior leaders welcome Inspector General scrutiny, it sends a powerful message. It communicates confidence in their actions, respect for institutional norms, and commitment to equal standards. When they resist, deflect, or preemptively reject accountability, it raises questions, not only about the specific incident under review, but about their broader relationship to oversight itself. During the hearing, the Secretary of Defense was asked a narrow, hypothetical question: if the Inspector General determines that classified information was mishandled, will accountability apply? This was not a demand for resignation. It was not an accusation. It was an inquiry into principle. The inability to answer affirmatively was therefore not a legal necessity, but a choice. That choice matters because Inspector General findings are not personal attacks. They are institutional tools. They exist to clarify facts, assess compliance, and recommend corrective action. In many cases, IG investigations result not in punishment, but in policy changes, training improvements, or procedural clarifications. They strengthen institutions by reinforcing norms. Resistance to IG oversight undermines that function. It reframes investigation as antagonism rather than stewardship. It implies that scrutiny is something to be avoided rather than embraced. For an institution that depends on trust and discipline, this posture is deeply damaging. For uniformed service members, the role of the Inspector General is well understood. IG officers are often the last recourse for reporting misconduct, unsafe practices, or abuse of authority. While the process can be slow and imperfect, it represents a commitment to fairness within a rigid hierarchy. When leaders at the top appear dismissive of that process, it sends a chilling signal downward. Service members know that IG investigations can be career-defining. They know that even unfounded allegations can carry stress and reputational cost. Yet they are still required to cooperate fully and transparently. There is no option to decline participation on the grounds that the mission was successful or that authority rests elsewhere. The contrast between that reality and the evasive posture displayed during the hearing is stark. It suggests a two-tiered system of accountability, one in which oversight is mandatory for those without power and negotiable for those with it. This perception has long-term consequences. Institutions do not collapse overnight when accountability weakens. They erode gradually. Confidence diminishes. Cynicism grows. The belief that rules are applied fairly gives way to the assumption that outcomes depend on rank and political alignment rather than conduct. The Inspector General process is designed to counteract that erosion. It exists to reaffirm that standards are not personal, political, or optional. They are institutional. When leaders resist even a hypothetical application of those standards to themselves, they weaken the very safeguard meant to protect the organization they lead. Another critical aspect of IG oversight is its relationship to transparency. While IG reports may contain classified sections, their conclusions and recommendations are often shared publicly or with Congress. This transparency is essential for democratic accountability. It allows lawmakers and citizens to assess whether institutions are functioning as intended. When executive officials appear hostile to this process, it risks transforming oversight into confrontation. That dynamic is unhealthy for civil-military relations. Oversight should not be a battle for dominance. It should be a shared commitment to institutional health. The hearing also revealed a deeper anxiety, fear of precedent. If accountability is acknowledged at the top, it establishes a standard that cannot easily be contained. Accepting responsibility, even conditionally, signals that authority does not shield leaders from consequences. For some, that may feel destabilizing. For institutions, it is stabilizing. History shows that military organizations are strongest when leaders model the behavior they demand. Accountability is not imposed by regulation alone. It is taught through example. When leaders accept scrutiny, they legitimize discipline. When they avoid it, they delegitimize enforcement. Segment 5 highlights why the Inspector General review is not a procedural footnote, but a critical test. It will not only assess whether specific information was mishandled, it will also test whether the Department of Defense remains committed to the principle that no individual, regardless of rank or political standing, is above the rules. In the final segment, we will examine the broader implications of selective accountability for democracy itself, the difference between civilian control and civilian immunity, and why the future of military professionalism depends on restoring accountability as a shared and universal obligation.